The moment Wallace Wells handed Alma Pritchard a handkerchief before the wagon even began to roll, she understood exactly what kind of man she had agreed to travel west with, and she tucked it into her pocket without a word, determined to return it to him unused. It was the spring of 1862, and the Oregon Trail stretched out ahead of their wagon company like a promise that God had written in dust and distance. The war had fractured the eastern states into something unrecognizable, and thousands of families were doing what Americans had always done when the world turned sharp and hostile. They were moving. They were pointing themselves toward the horizon and deciding that whatever lay beyond it had to be better than what they were leaving behind. Alma Pritchard was 24 years old, sharp-eyed and straight-backed, the daughter of a Missouri schoolteacher who had died of fever the previous November and left her with a small inheritance, a chest of books, her mother's silver compass, and absolutely no reason to stay in Independence. She had joined the wagon company organized by a man named Calhoun, paid her fair share for a covered wagon, 2 oxen named Bernard and George, and enough provisions to carry her 4 months into the future. She had also, through a series of practical negotiations that she was not entirely proud of, agreed to travel under the nominal protection of Wallace Wells, who was 27 and had broad shoulders and a square jaw and the confident air of a man who believed that the universe had specifically arranged itself for his convenience. Wallace Wells was not a bad man. That was the thing that made everything complicated. He was genuinely decent, generous in small ways, capable of hard work, and possessed of a laugh that came from somewhere deep and real. He had grown up farming in Ohio, lost his farm to debt 3 years prior, and had spent the intervening time doing whatever work presented itself, driving cattle, hauling freight, briefly working as a deputy in a town whose name he tried not to remember. He was heading to the Willamette Valley in Oregon because a man named Dewey Straddlemore had written him a letter claiming that the soil there was so rich you could drop a seed on a Tuesday and practically trip over the harvest by Friday. Wallace had folded that letter carefully and put it in his breast pocket and walked straight to Independence, Missouri, which was where he met Alma Pritchard standing in the provision store, arguing with the shopkeeper about the weight of a flour barrel. "She is right," Wallace had said, setting down his own list and examining the barrel in question. "That is short by at least 8 pounds. I would weigh it again if I were you." The shopkeeper had weighed it again. The shopkeeper had been wrong. Alma had looked at Wallace Wells with an expression that was not quite gratitude and not quite suspicion, but something precisely in between, and she had said, "Thank you," in a tone that suggested she had not actually needed his help, but was willing to acknowledge that he had provided it anyway. They had made a practical arrangement. She needed a capable man with a rifle on her wagon because the company's rules required it. He needed a wagon with space for his gear and tools because he had arrived in Independence 3 days prior, and the other wagons were already filled. Neither of them pretended it was anything more sentimental than arithmetic, and that, Alma thought, was a reasonable foundation. What she had not anticipated was that Wallace Wells would spend the first 3 days of the journey watching her with a particular kind of careful attention, as though he were solving a puzzle that he had not yet decided was worth solving. And what Wallace had not anticipated was that Alma Pritchard would wake before dawn every morning, climb to the seat of the wagon with a worn leather-bound book and her mother's silver compass, and spend 45 minutes studying the night sky before it surrendered to daylight. He caught her the 3rd morning. He had risen early because one of his oxen, the left one that he called Patterson, had been favoring a leg, and he wanted to check the hoof before the day's march began. He came around the side of the wagon and found Alma sitting perfectly still on the wagon seat with her book open across her knees and her face tipped upward toward the stars, her lips moving slightly as though she were having a conversation with Orion. "What are you doing?" he asked, not unkindly, but with the genuine bewilderment of a man who had never once woken up before dawn for any reason other than crisis. "Navigating," she said, without looking down. "We have a guide. Calhoun knows the trail." "Calhoun knows Calhoun's version of the trail," Alma said. She lowered her eyes to her book, traced a finger along a page, and then looked back up. "But the stars do not have opinions or personal preferences or reasons to lie to you. They simply are where they are, and if you understand what you are looking at, they will tell you exactly where you are and where you are going." Wallace stood there for a moment, the cold morning air settling around them both, and he looked up at the sky with honest curiosity. "Where did you learn that, my father?" She finally looked at him, and there was something in her expression that was not quite grief and not quite pride but lived somewhere between the two. "He taught school for 30 years. He believed that a person who could read the sky and read a map and read a book was prepared for anything the world might throw at them." She paused. "He was not wrong about the sky and the map. The book is still a matter I am evaluating." Wallace laughed, and it was that real laugh, the one that came from somewhere genuine, and Alma looked at him with mild surprise, as though she had not quite expected it from him. "Get some sleep," he said eventually. "We have a long march tomorrow." "I have had sufficient sleep," she said, and returned to her book, and that was the end of that morning's conversation. But Wallace Wells did not forget it. He thought about it the whole day as the wagons creaked westward across the Missouri prairie and the spring wind pushed at them from the south. He thought about Alma Pritchard sitting in the dark with a book about stars, perfectly calm, perfectly focused, perfectly unafraid, and he thought about the handkerchief he had pressed into her hand at the start of the journey, a gesture he had performed automatically, the kind of chivalrous reflex that a man of his time and place performed for women who were traveling into the unknown, and he felt, for the first time, slightly foolish about it. The wagon company was 34 people in total, spread across 8 wagons. There were 3 other families: the Dempsey family from Indiana, a couple with 4 children ranging from 6 to 14, a widow named Mrs. Hargreave, who was going to join her son in Oregon, and who knitted without pause from first light to last, a pair of brothers named Felix and Albert Drummond, who farmed together and argued constantly, and were apparently incapable of resolving any dispute without external mediation, and a young couple named Jonas and Clara Whitfield, who had been married only 6 weeks, and who were still in that particular state of new love that made everyone around them feel simultaneously warm and slightly exhausted. There was also the guide, Eli Calhoun, a leathery man in his 50s who had made this journey 4 times and knew every water hole and river crossing and storm-prone valley between Independence and the Willamette Valley, and who had opinions about every single one of them. Alma liked Mrs. Hargreave immediately, and the Dempsey children eventually, and the Drummond brothers at arm's length. She found Jonas and Clara Whitfield sweet in the way that she sometimes found very young animals sweet, with affection and an acknowledgement that they had not yet been tested. She respected Eli Calhoun's knowledge without always respecting his conclusions. And Wallace Wells she had not yet fully categorized. He kept surprising her. The first surprise came on the 4th day, when one of the Dempsey children, a 8-year-old boy named Thomas, fell from his family's wagon while it was moving and landed badly and lay in the dust crying with what appeared to be a broken wrist. The whole company stopped. Mrs. Dempsey wept. Mr. Dempsey went pale. Several of the men stood around the boy with the helpless energy of people who understood that the situation required action, but could not determine what action it required. Wallace crouched down beside Thomas and said, in a voice that was calm and warm and completely certain, "Let me look at it." He examined the wrist carefully without rushing. "It is broken," he said to the parents, not as a verdict but as information. "I have set bones before. I can do it properly if you will allow me." He looked at Thomas directly. "It is going to hurt for a moment. I will not pretend otherwise, but afterward it will hurt considerably less, and then we will wrap it up and you will be more comfortable. Do you understand?" Thomas, 8 years old and tear-streaked and probably frightened of the dust, and the distance and the great emptiness of the prairie as much as the broken bone, looked at Wallace Wells and nodded. Wallace set the bone. He did it quickly and with evident competence, and Thomas yelled once and then went quiet. And then Wallace wrapped the wrist in strips of clean cloth that he produced from somewhere in his gear, and fashioned a splint from a piece of straight wood, and told Mrs. Dempsey to watch for swelling and to come find him immediately if the boy developed a fever. Alma watched all of this from the shade beside her wagon. When it was done and the company had reorganized itself and begun moving again, she fell into step beside Wallace for a while, which was unusual. "Where did you learn to set a bone?" she asked. "Cattle drives," he said. "Men fall from horses. Sometimes a doctor is 3 days' ride away and the situation is not. You learn what you can." "You were good with him," she said. "With Thomas. You did not talk down to him." Wallace glanced at her. "He is 8 years old and he was in pain and he was frightened and he needed to trust me enough to let me help him. Talking down to him would have made all of that worse." Alma was quiet for a moment. Most men would have simply done what needed doing without considering how to deliver it. "Most men waste a great deal of energy not thinking about other people," Wallace said, and he said it without particular pride or agenda, just as an observation about a thing he had noticed, and Alma found that she had no suitable response, so she said nothing. And after a while she fell back to walk beside her wagon, and Wallace went to check on Patterson's hoof. The days began to develop a rhythm. The company rose before dawn and traveled until midday heat made the oxen miserable, then rested for 2 hours, then traveled again until dusk. The prairie gave way gradually to rolling hills, and then to the first suggestions of the Great Plains, and the sky above them grew enormous in the way that skies only grow when there is nothing left to interrupt them. Alma noted landmarks in a small journal she carried, measured distances, and each evening she cross-referenced their position against the stars and against the maps she had brought from Independence, 3 maps, which she had purchased from a cartographer's shop and which differed from each other in several important respects that she had been systematically investigating. Wallace noticed the journal. He noticed the maps. He noticed that every evening, while the rest of the company cooked and ate and socialized around the fire, Alma would spread her maps on the wagon's tailgate with a lantern and a straight edge and work through whatever calculations she was working through, and he found himself slowing as he passed, pretending to check the harness or inspect a wheel, just so he could catch a glimpse of what she was doing. One evening, 3 weeks into the journey, he stopped pretending. "May I look?" he asked. She considered him for a moment, and then she moved the lantern slightly to make room. He leaned over the tailgate and looked at the maps and the notes she had written in the margins, small tight handwriting in pencil, and he realized that she was not simply following the trail. She was building a record of it, measuring and annotating and correcting the existing maps against actual observation. "These 3 maps disagree about the location of the South Fork crossing," she said, pointing. "This one puts it here, this one here, and this one places it nearly 4 miles east of where the other 2 agree it should be. I believe this one is the most accurate, based on our current position relative to the landmarks we have passed, but I will not know for certain until we reach it." "How do you know our current position?" Wallace asked. "Polaris," she said simply. She looked up at the sky and pointed. "North Star, it does not move. Everything else rotates around it. If you know where Polaris is, you know which direction is north. And if you know which direction is north and you know how far you have traveled and in which general direction, you can calculate your approximate position with reasonable accuracy." Wallace looked at the star she was pointing to. It was clear and steady and, as she said, entirely unmoving while everything around it slowly wheeled. "Your father taught you this," he said. "My father taught me the basics," she said. "I have spent the last 8 years expanding on them. I have 3 books on celestial navigation." She patted the chest inside the wagon. 2 from my father's collection and 1 I ordered from a bookshop in St. Louis. "That is extraordinary," Wallace said, and he meant it completely and without condescension, and something about the fact that he meant it, that she could tell he meant it, made Alma straighten slightly. "It is simply knowledge," she said, but less dismissively than she might have said it 3 weeks earlier. Wallace leaned against the wagon and looked at the map again. "What will you do when you reach Oregon?" he asked. "Teach," she said. "I intend to open a school." There are communities in the valley that have no formal schooling. Children are growing up without the tools they need to navigate the world. She paused. "I mean that both literally and figuratively." Wallace smiled. "And who is waiting for you there, family?" "No one," she said, with a clarity that was neither sad nor defiant but simply honest. "My father is gone. My mother went before him. I have a cousin in St. Louis who writes occasionally, but I am not going to Oregon to be near someone. I am going because it is where I have decided to build something." "That takes courage," Wallace said, "going toward a place rather than away from a person." Alma looked at him with an expression that he could not quite read. "What are you going toward?" she asked. "A farm," he said. "Rich soil, something that is mine that no bank can take from me." He said it simply, but she heard the weight underneath it, the way certain words carry the full history of why they matter. "The farm you lost," she said. He was quiet for a moment. 3 years ago, drought and a bad loan and a banker who had less patience than the situation warranted." He shrugged, and the shrug was meant to say that he had made his peace with it. But his jaw was tight in a way that suggested peace was more of an ongoing negotiation than a concluded one. "I rebuilt what I could in the time since. I have enough now to start again properly. I will not make the same mistakes." "What were the mistakes?" she asked, genuinely curious. He looked at her. Most people, when they learned about the farm, either changed the subject uncomfortably or offered a sympathy that wanted nothing in return except to feel that they had offered it. Alma Pritchard asked what the mistakes were, with the direct curiosity of someone who considered information more useful than comfort. "I planted one crop," he said. "Too much of one thing, too much debt to acquire the land, too much trust in the weather to be the same 2 years in a row." He paused. "And I was too proud to ask for help until it was too late." "Diversify your planting," she said immediately. "Multiple crops, different drought tolerances, different growing seasons. Never let one failure take everything." "Yes," he said, "that is exactly right." They looked at each other across the lantern light, and something shifted between them. It was small and quiet, and neither of them named it. Alma looked back at her maps, and Wallace pushed off from the wagon and said good night and walked back to his fire. And he lay awake for a while looking at Polaris, which was exactly where she had said it would be. The trouble with the South Fork crossing arrived when the map said it would, and confirmed Alma's prediction in every particular. The fork was in the position her analysis had indicated, and the crossing Calhoun had planned turned out to be deeper than expected. Spring runoff had raised the water levels significantly, and Calhoun stood at the edge of it with his hat in his hands and his brow furrowed, recalculating. Alma had walked forward to look. Wallace was beside her. "There is a shallower crossing approximately 1.5 miles upstream," she said to Calhoun. Calhoun looked at her with the kind of expression that men of his era and experience sometimes wore when a woman offered navigational information, a brief internal struggle between dismissal and the pragmatic question of whether she might actually be right. "How do you know that?" he asked. "The topography," she said. She pointed upstream to where the land dipped and the trees grew differently, the pattern of vegetation suggesting a point where the riverbed was wider and therefore shallower. "The riverbed broadens there. Wide crossings are typically shallower crossings." Calhoun studied the landscape for a long moment. Then he looked at Wallace, which was the part that irritated Alma, though she kept her face still. "I believe she is correct," Wallace said, meeting Calhoun's eyes steadily. "I would take her assessment seriously." Calhoun took the upstream crossing. The water was knee-deep on the oxen, and the wagons went through without incident, while the original crossing, which he had been planning, was chest-deep and moving with the particular purposeful speed of snowmelt. That evening, while Alma was arranging her maps, Mrs. Hargreave materialized at her elbow with a cup of coffee and an expression of warm solidarity. "You were right about the crossing," Mrs. Hargreaves said. "Everyone knows it." Calhoun was willing to be corrected, Alma said. "That is the thing that matters. A man who cannot be corrected is more dangerous than a man who makes mistakes." "Mr. Wells said you were right before Calhoun agreed," Mrs. Hargreaves said, with the particular lightness of a woman who has been watching something develop with interested patience. "He was being practical," Alma said Mrs. Hargreaves, in a tone that contained several complete sentences, and finished her coffee and returned to her wagon. The weeks accumulated. The prairie resolved into the sandhills of what would later be called Nebraska, and the trail climbed gradually toward the first of the great continental landmarks, Chimney Rock, which rose from the flat land ahead of them like a declaration that the world was stranger and more various than anything they had imagined back in Missouri. When they came around a low ridge and saw it for the first time, that improbable spire of rock pointing at the sky, the whole company stopped for a moment in collective silence. "My father described it," Alma said, half to herself, standing beside her wagon with her hands shading her eyes. "He never made this journey, but he had a student who had, and the student wrote him a letter from Oregon describing every significant landmark. He read me that letter when I was 12. She paused. "It looks exactly like what I imagined." Wallace was standing 3 feet away, and he had been watching her face when she saw the rock, and now he felt something he was not entirely prepared for, a tenderness that was not the same as the practical concern he had been telling himself was the basis of his increasing attention to Alma Pritchard. This was different. This was the kind of feeling that arrives without asking permission and then refuses to leave without a fight. He said nothing. He was a practical man, and he understood that feelings required the right moment, and this was not yet the right moment. But it was the beginning of something. The Drummond brothers began their most significant argument somewhere in the Sandhills, a dispute about property that had apparently been simmering for years and now boiled over in the general stress of weeks of difficult travel. Felix claimed that Albert had borrowed money from their collective farm earnings 12 years prior and never repaid it. Albert claimed the money had been a gift. The argument deteriorated into 3 days of absolute non-communication during which they drove their wagon in separate and pointed silences, Felix on the left, Albert on the right, staring rigidly at their respective horizons. Alma intervened on the 3rd day. She walked up to their wagon during the midday rest, sat down on a nearby rock, and said, "This is going to end in one of you dying alone somewhere in Utah, and the other one spending the rest of his life feeling terrible about it. I suggest you resolve it now." Both brothers looked at her. "With respect, Miss Pritchard," Felix started. "It is a 12-year-old debt," Alma said. "Felix, even if Albert owes you that money, and the fact that you cannot agree on whether it was a loan or a gift suggests that the communication between you at the time was insufficiently clear, which means you both share some responsibility for the confusion. Even if he owes it, is it worth your brother? Is it worth arriving in Oregon without the person who has been beside you your whole life?" There was a long silence. "He never said thank you," Albert said suddenly, and his voice was not angry anymore but something more complicated and raw. "I gave him that money when he was sick and the doctor's bills were going to break us, and he never once said thank you, and then 5 years later he started calling it a debt." Felix went very still. "I did not think," he said slowly. "I did not think to say it. I was ashamed to need it in the first place." The silence that followed had a different quality. Alma stood up and walked away, and behind her she heard, very quietly, the sound of the conversation beginning to find its way toward something better. Wallace, who had observed the whole exchange from a discreet distance, fell into step beside her. "You did not have to do that," he said. "No," she agreed. "But we have to travel together for another 3 months, and watching 2 grown men make each other miserable over something that could be resolved with an honest conversation was becoming genuinely tedious." "You are not as unsentimental as you pretend to be," he said. She looked at him sharply. "I am not pretending anything." "You care about them," he said simply. You care about all of them, this whole company. You just do not like to show it because you have decided that showing it makes you appear weak." The sharpness in her expression shifted to something more complicated. "That is a very direct observation," she said. "You are a very direct person," he said. It seemed like the appropriate register. She was quiet for a few strides. "My father cried at the end of every school year," she said finally. "Every year without fail, because his students were leaving and he loved them and he would miss them and he was not at all ashamed of any of it. I always respected that about him. I have not managed to learn it for myself yet." "You will," Wallace said. "You cannot know that," she said. "No," he admitted, "but I believe it." She looked straight ahead at the trail and said nothing, but her shoulders were less rigid than they had been a moment before. The great landmark of Fort Laramie arrived in mid-June, and the company stopped to resupply and rest for 3 days. The fort was a gathering place and a trading post, and a source of news from the east and west, and it hummed with the activity of dozens of wagon companies at various stages of their journey. Alma restocked her paper supply, purchased a new pencil, and had a long conversation with an Army scout who had been on the trail for 20 years and who had opinions about the mountain crossings that she found considerably more useful than 3 of her 4 existing maps combined. She also received a piece of news that stopped her mid-stride in the middle of the fort's central yard. The man who delivered it was a postal rider, resting his horse before heading east. He was from Independence, had left 6 weeks after the wagon company, and was carrying news of the wider world. He had a newspaper, 3 weeks old, and he offered it to anyone who wanted to read it. Alma read it. She stood in the dusty yard of Fort Laramie and read it, and her face went through several things in the space of 2 minutes: a tightening around the eyes, a compression of the mouth, and then a long, controlled exhalation. The war. The war back east was worse than any of the news they had heard before leaving, the casualties staggering and the end nowhere visible on the horizon. Wallace found her there, standing still in the middle of the fort yard with the newspaper folded in her hands. "Is there someone?" he asked quietly. "A cousin," she said. "Henry, he enlisted last fall. I knew he was in it. I did not know." She stopped, pressed the newspaper carefully. "I do not know if he is alive. There is no way to know from here." Wallace stood beside her and did not offer false comfort or convenient optimism. He simply stood there, and after a moment his hand found hers, not romantically, not with any agenda, just with the solid warmth of one human being telling another that they were not alone. Alma looked at their joined hands and then looked at his face, and something in her expression was very close to the gratitude she had been withholding since he identified the underweight flour barrel in Independence. "Thank you," she said. "I have family in Virginia," he said. "2 brothers. I do not know which side they are on, or whether they are on any side, or whether they are still alive. I stopped being able to think about it directly about 3 weeks into this journey because I cannot do anything about it from here, and I cannot navigate a wagon train while going to pieces." "No," she agreed. "You cannot." She folded the newspaper and tucked it under her arm. "I think I understand your practical manner a great deal better now. Practicality is sometimes what you use," he said, "when the alternative is falling down." She held his gaze for a long moment. "Yes," she said, "it is." They had dinner together that evening, just the 2 of them, at a table inside the fort's rough establishment, eating salt pork and beans that were cooked by someone else for the first time in weeks. The novelty of not cooking their own meal created an ease that the trail had not quite provided, and they talked for 3 hours, and Alma told him about her father's school and the 24 students who had passed through it over the years, and who still sometimes wrote to say where they had ended up and what they were doing. Wallace told her about Ohio and the farm, and what it had been like to watch something you had built with your hands and your hope and your early mornings slowly come undone. "Were you married?" she asked at one point. It was a direct question, and she asked it directly, and he appreciated that. "No," he said, "I was close once. A woman named Pearl, in the year before the farm failed. But when the farm began to go, she went with it, and I think she made the correct decision for herself even if it did not feel like it at the time. I was close once, Alma said. A man named Gerald Hoskins who wanted very much for me to be a different sort of person than I am. He was not a bad man. He simply wanted a wife who would look to him for direction, and I am constitutionally incapable of that. What sort of direction? Wallace asked. Any sort, she said. Gerald wanted to choose our route on an afternoon drive. He wanted to tell me which book to read. He wanted to arrange my life the way you arrange furniture, which is to say, according to his understanding of where things ought to go. She said it without bitterness, with the calm assessment of someone who has worked through an old injury to the place where it is simply a scar. I was not the wife he needed. I hope he found one. Wallace looked at her across the table, at this woman who had navigated a river crossing from a topography reed, who argued flower weights and consulted stars and brokered peace between feuding brothers, who had tucked his handkerchief into her pocket and returned it to him 3 weeks later with a quiet dignity that said everything without saying anything. Some men, he said carefully, do not need to direct. Some men find it far more interesting to watch where someone is going and decide whether they would like to go there too. The lantern between them flickered. Alma's eyes were very steady on his. "And are you that kind of man?" she asked. He held her gaze. "I am finding out," he said honestly. They walked back to the wagon side by side in the warm June night, and the stars were brilliant above the fort, and Alma tilted her head back and identified 4 constellations without pausing, not for his benefit, but because it was simply what she did, the way some people hum without realizing it. Wallace looked where she pointed and saw what she was seeing and understood, for the first time and with sudden clarity, that navigating by stars was not simply a skill. It was a way of being in the world, of locating yourself in relation to fixed and certain things, so that nothing that moves beneath your feet can entirely disorient you. He wanted to know everything about it. He wanted to know everything about her. They left Fort Laramie the following morning, and the trail climbed steeply toward the Rocky Mountains, and the weeks ahead proved the hardest of the journey so far. The South Pass through the mountains was breathtaking in its beauty and exhausting in its demand. The altitude thin, the wagons laboring, the oxen requiring careful management and extra water. 2 of the Dempsey children got mountain sickness and had to ride in the wagon for 3 days, and Patterson, Wallace's left ox, finally needed the kind of rest that meant stopping for an afternoon while everyone else pressed on, which cost Wallace and Alma the comfort of the group's company and left them moving behind by half a day. Alma did not mind. Wallace suspected she almost preferred it. They made their own fire that evening, half a day behind the rest of the company, in a high meadow between 2 rocky ridges where the grass was thick and the creek was cold, and the sky above them was so thick with stars that it looked like someone had spilled a jar of salt across a dark cloth. "Tell me about the first time you understood the stars," Wallace said. He had been wanting to ask it for weeks. Alma stoked the fire and looked up, and her face in the firelight was open in a way he had not seen it, not guarded, not brisk, not efficiently navigating some problem. Simply open. "I was 9, she said. "My father took me outside after dinner and pointed up and said, 'Do you see that pattern?' And I said yes. And he said that pattern has a name and people have been looking at it and naming it and navigating by it for thousands of years. Ancient sailors crossed oceans by following those lights. Farmers planted crops by them. Storytellers built entire mythologies around them. Every culture on Earth has looked at the same sky and found meaning in it." She paused. "And then he said, and that means that right now, at this very moment, you are not alone. Every person who ever lived has looked at these same stars. You are connected to all of them." Wallace was quiet. The fire popped. "I think I understood something very important about your father just then," he said. "He was the best person I have ever known," she said simply. "He died believing that knowledge was the most generous gift you could give another person. He gave it away his whole life." "You are giving it away too," Wallace said. "That is what the school is. That is what the navigation and the maps and all of it is. You are your father's student, and you have been giving away what he gave you since the day he died." The firelight moved across her face, and Alma Pritchard, who had not cried in public since her father's funeral, felt something press hard against the back of her throat. She did not let it out, but she did not pretend it was not there either, which was new. "I am going to find the school a good location," she said after a moment. "Somewhere central so children from several communities can reach it. I have been thinking about the layout of the valley and where the likely settlement patterns will be, and I believe that—" She stopped herself, looked at him. "I am deflecting." "I noticed," he said gently. "It is," she admitted, "a reliable habit." "You do not have to stop on my account," he said. "But if you wanted to not deflect just for a moment, I am not going anywhere tonight." The fire settled low. The stars wheeled. Patterson, rested and restored, grazed contentedly in the meadow grass. "I miss him every single day," Alma said quietly. "And I think the stars are the one place where missing him feels like being close to him rather than being without him." Wallace did not say anything at all. He simply sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, and let the night be what it was, and Alma did not move away, and neither did he. The morning came cold and bright, and they broke camp efficiently and caught the rest of the company by noon. And nothing was said about the evening before, but something had shifted in the geometry of the space between them, and they both knew it. Jonas Whitfield sprained his ankle severely at a river ford in what would later be called Idaho, and was reduced to riding in the wagon while Clara took the reins. Clara, 6 weeks from her Missouri parlor and considerably more capable than she had appeared at the journey's beginning, handled the oxen with growing confidence. But there came an evening when she was tired and frightened and homesick all at once, and she sat by Alma's fire rather than her own, and Alma made her tea from the small supply she had been carefully rationing and sat with her, and listened to Clara talk about whether she had made the right decision, whether leaving everything familiar was worth it, whether she was strong enough for what lay ahead. "I did not think it would be this hard," Clara said. "No one does," Alma said. "The maps make the distances look manageable because they have no way of showing you the quality of the miles." "Are you frightened?" Clara asked. "Ever?" Alma considered this with the honest care she gave every question. "Yes," she said. "Different things at different times. In Missouri, before we left, I was frightened that I was making a mistake, that I was running away from something while telling myself I was running toward it. In the Sandhills, I was frightened by how easy it would be to simply stop and never start again. In the mountains, I was frightened by how small we are against all of that rock and wind." She paused. "But I have found that fear is mostly information. It tells you what you care about. And what I care about is the school and the valley and what comes next. That is worth being frightened for." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Do you care about Mr. Wells?" she asked, with the particular directness of a very young woman who has not yet learned to make such questions less obvious. "Clara," Alma said with a warning note. "I see you together," Clara said, undeterred. "I see the way he looks at you when you are doing your maps, like you are something he has never seen before and cannot entirely believe is real." "You are 20 years old and very recently in love," Alma said. "Everything looks like a love story to you at present." "Some things are love stories," Clara said reasonably. "Go to sleep," Alma said. "Jonas needs you rested." But after Clara left, Alma sat by the dying fire for a long time, looking at the maps she had spread on the tailgate and not quite reading them. The next morning, Wallace appeared at her elbow before the company had finished hitching their teams and said without preamble, "I need you to teach me how to read the stars." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because you are right that it is more reliable than a map," he said. "And because I have a farm to find and I would like to be certain I end up in the correct valley." She held his gaze for a moment. "That is a practical reason," she said. "It is the practical reason," he agreed. "Are there other reasons you would find more convincing?" The corner of her mouth moved. "Tonight," she said, "after camp is made." He nodded and went to hitch his oxen. That night she spread her star charts beside the fire and began at the beginning Polaris, The fixed point, the North Star, the anchor of the whole system, and Wallace sat beside her and listened with the complete attention of a man who is genuinely learning something, asking precise questions and remembering the answers and finding the stars she named with an accuracy that surprised her. "You are good at this," she said, after he correctly located Cassiopeia on the first try. "I am good at learning things that matter," he said. "The trick is finding things that matter." She looked at him across the star chart. In the firelight, his face was very honest, nothing performed or arranged, just the face of a man who was exactly where he intended to be, looking at exactly what he intended to look at. "Wallace," she said, and his name in her mouth was different than it had ever been before, less formal, more real. "Yes," he said. "Why did you really ask me to teach you?" He was quiet for a long moment. The fire snapped. The stars were where they always were. "Because you know something I do not know," he said, "and I want to understand the world the way you understand it. Because every time you explain something, I understand not just the thing you are explaining, but how your mind moves and what you love and why you care about the things you care about. And I have found that I am very interested in all of that." He paused. "And because I am not a man who needs to direct. I told you that weeks ago. I am still finding out whether it is true, and I think the answer is yes, but I wanted you to know that I am still working on it honestly and not simply saying the flattering thing." Alma set down her star chart very carefully. "You are," she said, "the most unexpected person I have ever met." "That is not a no," he said. "It is not anything yet," she said. "Except honest. Honest is the only thing I want from you," he said. "The rest can wait." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she picked up her star chart again and said, "Orion," and pointed, and he found it, and they kept going until the fire burned down to coals and the night was very cold and very still and very full of fixed lights that knew exactly where they were. There was a crisis in August, in the Blue Mountains of Oregon, when the trail steepened sharply, and the wagons began to labor in ways they had not since the Rockies. One of the Dempsey wagons lost a wheel when the iron rim cracked against a sharp boulder, and the whole company halted for 2 days while repairs were improvised. Eli Calhoun, consulting his experience of 4 previous crossings, wanted to take a northern route around the worst of the peaks, which would add 5 days to the journey. Several of the men in the company were in favor of this. The provisions situation was not desperate, but it was not comfortable either, and an extra 5 days was a serious consideration. Alma had been studying the terrain and her maps for 2 days before Calhoun called the meeting. "There is a pass," she said, when Calhoun had finished laying out his proposal. The men around the fire looked at her with varying degrees of attentiveness. "Approximately here." She held up her map and indicated a line through the mountains that cut several miles north of Calhoun's northern route, but was more direct than either his southern route or his proposed northern detour. "The scout at Fort Laramie described it to me. It is steep but negotiable with the wagon's light, and it shaves 2 days off the northern route." "The scout," Calhoun said. "20-year veteran named Morrison," Alma said. "He had no reason to mislead me and every reason to know this range accurately. He described the approach landmarks in sufficient detail that I can match them to what we have seen in the last 2 days, and his description is accurate on every point so far." Calhoun studied his own maps, which were good maps but older and less annotated than Alma's. "What does lightning the wagons mean?" Felix Drummond asked. "Anything that is not food or tools or medical supplies," Alma said. "Furniture, extra clothing, things you were carrying for comfort rather than survival." There was a significant silence. People on the Oregon Trail gave up beloved things on this journey: rocking chairs and china cabinets and iron stoves, left beside the trail in heartbreaking cairns of abandoned domesticity. It was a real sacrifice, and Alma did not minimize it. "I have a writing desk that belonged to my grandmother," Mrs. Hargreaves said quietly. "I know," Alma said, and her voice was gentle. "I am sorry," Wallace spoke up. "I have a set of tools I was planning to use for building. I can cache some of the heavier ones and replace them in Oregon. That is 100 pounds off my wagon at minimum." Calhoun looked at Alma, looked at his map, looked at the mountains. He was not a man who liked to be overruled, but he was fundamentally a man who preferred survival to pride, and 23 years of trail experience had taught him to recognize the difference between an opinion and actual knowledge. "We take Miss Pritchard's route," he said. They lightened the wagons. Mrs. Hargreaves' writing desk was left beside the trail with her grandmother's initials carved into the front, and she stood beside it for a long moment before climbing back into her wagon. Alma watched her and felt the weight of it, and that night she sat with Mrs. Hargreave and asked her about the grandmother, and listened for 2 hours, and Mrs. Hargreave went to sleep slightly lighter in the particular way that having been heard makes a person lighter. The pass was exactly as the scout had described. It was steep and demanding, and one of the Drummond oxen slipped badly and had to be steadied by 5 men throwing their weight into the harness. But they got through it, all 8 wagons, and on the other side the mountain fell away, and the valley opened below them in the long light of an August afternoon, green and vast and real. Alma stood at the head of the pass and looked at it. She had been looking at maps of this valley for a year. She had read every description of it she could find, had talked to returned travelers, had studied the reports of survey expeditions, had imagined it on 100 evenings in Missouri while her father was still alive, and on 100 more evenings after he was not. And now here it was, enormous and green and true, laid out below her like an answer to a question that had taken her whole life to formulate. She did not cry, but she felt the whole of it settle into her chest like something that had been waiting to arrive. Wallace appeared beside her. He had come up from the back of the company and now stood at the edge of the pass looking at the valley, and his face was the face of a man who has been heading toward something for so long that arriving feels less like triumph than recognition. "There it is," he said. "There it is," she agreed. His hand found hers again as it had in the fort yard, and this time neither of them pretended it was simply comfort. This time they both knew what it was, and neither of them moved away, and they stood at the head of the pass with the Willamette Valley spread below them like a gift and held on. They descended into the valley over the following 2 days, and the company gradually dispersed to their various destinations. The Dempseys to a community settlement 20 miles north, the Drummond brothers to a land claim their advance man had staked for them, Mrs. Hargreave to the town where her son was waiting, Jonas and Clara Whitfield to a farm that Jonas had inherited from an uncle. The dispersal was the kind of gentle dissolution that happens when a community of necessity becomes a community of choice, and the people in it rediscover that they are individuals again. Eli Calhoun shook everyone's hand at the final fork in the trail, and when he got to Alma he held her hand for an extra beat and said, "You would make a hell of a guide, Miss Pritchard," and she said, "I intend to make a school instead," and he laughed and touched his hat and rode away. And then it was Alma and Wallace, standing at the junction with their wagons and their oxen and 4 months of shared journey behind them. "The town of Millhaven is approximately 15 miles east," Alma said. She had been corresponding with a land agent there since the previous winter. "There is a lot available near the center of the settlement that would be suitable for a school building." "Millhaven is also near some of the most arable land in the valley," Wallace said. He pulled a second letter from his pocket, the letter from Dewey Straddlemore that had started all of this. "Dewey says there is a farm claim 8 miles northeast of the town center." They looked at each other. 8 miles is manageable," Alma said. "It is very manageable," he agreed. "That is not a declaration of anything," she said carefully. "No," he said. "It is a geographical observation." "Good," she said. "Then we should go." They went. The land agent in Millhaven was a thin, cheerful man named Odell who had been in the valley for 7 years, and who was delighted to see people arriving from the east, which was his primary source of income. He showed Alma the lot near the town center, which was larger than she had imagined and backed by a stand of Douglas firs, and sat beside a creek with clean water, and she walked it in 4 directions and examined the soil and tested the drainage and looked at the angle of the winter sun, and said she would take it. She also, on Odell's recommendation, arranged lodging at a house nearby owned by a widow named Eunice Marks, who kept a clean room and charged a reasonable rate and cooked better than anyone had cooked for Alma in 4 months, and who was sufficiently wise about people that she took one look at Alma and Wallace together when they arrived at her door, and made a particular decision about the spare rooms that gave them adjacent quarters, and said nothing whatsoever about it. Wallace's farm claim was exactly as Dewey Straddlemore had described: rich bottom land with a creek running through it, and a small structure that was more suggestion than building, which needed replacing entirely, and a view of the mountains that on clear days took the breath away. He spent the first weeks clearing and preparing the soil for a late-season planting of winter crops, and the physical work of it settled something in him that had been unsettled for 3 years, since the Ohio farm went under and he had been drifting. He rode into Millhaven every few days on a horse he had purchased from a valley rancher, a solid bay mare he called simply the mare, and he helped Alma supervise the construction of the school building, which was being built by a local carpenter named Hess and 2 apprentices, and he argued cheerfully with Hess about the angle of the roof and the size of the windows and the placement of the door, and Alma let him argue because Hess was the kind of carpenter who needed argument to reach his best work. And because watching Wallace talk through a structural problem with the same careful thoroughness he brought to everything else was becoming one of her favorite occupations. The school took 3 weeks to build. On the morning of its completion, when Hess and his apprentices had packed their tools and departed, and the building stood there, square and solid with good large windows and a proper door, and a bell tower that Alma had insisted on despite Hess's reservations, she walked into it alone for the first time and stood in the middle of the empty floor and looked at the room that would be full of children by spring, and felt something so large and complete that she stood still for a full minute, not moving. Simply feeling it, Wallace found her there when he arrived. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her face, and then he looked at the room, the good light coming through the windows, the clean floor, the simple solid walls. "It is exactly right," he said. "It is exactly right," she agreed. He came and stood beside her. The October light lay warm across the floor between them. "I have something I want to say," he said, "and I want to say it clearly because I have found that with you the only way to say a thing is directly." She turned to face him. Her eyes were steady and very dark and entirely unafraid. "I have known many people in my life," he said. "I have worked with men I respected and admired, men I could not emulate, and met women I thought were interesting for an evening and occasionally for longer. I have never in my life encountered anyone who altered the way I see the world simply by being in it." He paused. "You altered the way I see the world. The stars and the maps and the way you move through a problem and the way you love the people around you without being willing to show it until you trust them, and the way you carry your father with you. You changed what I see when I look at the sky and what I believe is possible, and what I understand about what a person can be. And I would like to spend the rest of my life knowing you better than I currently do. I would like it to be a formal arrangement. I would like to ask if you will marry me." The room was very quiet. Outside, someone's horse went by on the main road of Millhaven. "I have conditions," Alma said. "I would expect nothing less," he said. "I will keep the school," she said. "That is not optional. It is why I came here. It is one of the things I love most about you," he said without hesitation. "And I would not take it from you even if you offered it freely. I will navigate," she said, "by stars or by map or by my own judgment. I will make my own decisions about direction." "I threw my map away 3 days out of Fort Laramie," he said. "I have been following your lead since then." She looked at him with a sudden sharpness. "You did not." "I did," he said. "I threw it in the fire because yours were better and I was tired of carrying redundant paper." He paused. "Also because it felt like the right thing to do." For the first time since Independence, Missouri, Alma Pritchard smiled at Wallace Wells with her whole face, not the controlled, partial smile she deployed when something was moderately amusing, but a full, unguarded, complete smile that changed her entire face and made her look, for a moment, very young and very happy, and exactly like the daughter of a man who had cried at the end of every school year because he loved his students and was not ashamed of it. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He cupped her face in his hands, which were rough and warm, and had set a child's broken bone with steady competence. And she put her hands over his, and he kissed her in the new school building with the October light coming through the good windows. And it was nothing like anything either of them had expected, and exactly like everything they needed. They were married by the pastor in Millhaven 6 weeks later, on a clear November morning when the mountains were showing the first of their winter snow, and the valley was golden and still. Mrs. Hargreave came from her son's house 20 miles away and wept with uncomplicated happiness and presented Alma with her grandmother's silver thimble, which had survived the journey in her apron pocket. Eunice Marks baked a cake with dried fruit and whiskey, and it was the best thing anyone had eaten since Missouri. The Whitfields attended, Jonah's walking now with only a slight limp, Clara visibly and happily pregnant. Even Eli Calhoun appeared, passing through the valley on his way back east to lead another company in the spring, and he ate 2 pieces of cake and said he had never attended a better party. Alma wore her mother's blue wool dress and her father's compass on a ribbon around her neck, tucked inside the dress where only she could feel it, and she married Wallace Wells with the full force of her attention and her honesty, and her carefully guarded heart thrown open without reservation. He looked at her across the small gathering and she looked at him, and neither of them needed anyone else in that moment, only each other and the valley and the mountains and the sky above it all, the same sky that had been guiding people home for thousands of years. The first winter was hard and beautiful. The farm cabin was small and warm, and Wallace had built it well, and Alma filled it with books and maps that she hung on the walls and the star charts that she updated each season, as she learned the Pacific sky's particular quality of darkness and light. She taught herself to bake properly, which she had never done in Missouri because her father's housekeeper had managed the kitchen, and she burned 4 batches of cornbread and 1 disastrous attempt at a pie before achieving a consistency that Wallace ate without any diplomatic pretense of enthusiasm. "You do not have to eat it if it is terrible," she told him, after the disastrous pie. "It is getting better," he said, with the careful honesty of a man who loves someone too much to lie to them but too much to be cruel. "That is not the same as being good," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it is encouraging." She laughed, and the laugh was that real laugh, the one that had surprised him the first morning he had heard it in the cold before dawn outside Independence, and he reached across the table and took her hand because he was still not entirely used to being allowed to do that whenever he wanted, and the feeling of being allowed to do that whenever he wanted was one of the best feelings he had ever known. The school opened in February of 1863, when the winter was easing enough for families to make the trip into Millhaven with their children. The first day, Alma stood at the door of the building she had imagined for a year and watched 11 children aged 6 to 15 file in and find their seats, and the feeling was so large that she had to swallow 3 times before she trusted her voice. She taught reading and arithmetic and history and geography, and on Friday afternoons, she taught the older students celestial navigation. She spread the star charts on the largest table and let them find Polaris and then let them find everything else from there. And she told them what her father had told her, that every person who ever lived had looked at these same stars, and that meant they were connected to all of them, and that the sky was a map that no one owned and everyone could read. Wallace sometimes came to watch the Friday sessions. He sat at the back and said nothing, and watched his wife teach with the complete and concentrated love of a man who understands that he is witnessing something important and wants to be entirely present for it. Spring came, and with it the second round of planting. Wallace had diversified his crops as Alma had suggested in that first long conversation, outside Independence wheat and corn and oats and a kitchen garden of vegetables. And by summer it was clear that the farm was going to produce well. Not spectacularly, not the fairy tale harvest of Dewey Straddlemore's letter, but solidly and steadily, and in a way that would see them through the next winter with reserves, and the winter after that, and the one after that. It was real in the way that only honestly earned things are real. News from the East continued to arrive, weeks delayed. The war ground on through 1863 with a weight that pressed on everyone who had come west to escape the East's escalating grief. Alma's cousin Henry was confirmed alive and whole in a letter that arrived in June, which she read 3 times and then sat with in the school building alone for a while before going home to tell Wallace. Wallace received word of his brothers in August. Both alive. One had fought, one had not. Both were in Ohio. He wrote to them both immediately, long letters that took him 3 evenings, and sent them east with the postal rider, and began the process of rebuilding the correspondence that the journey had interrupted. By the fall of 1863, Alma was expecting their first child. She discovered it in September and sat with the knowledge for 3 days before telling Wallace, not because she was afraid of his reaction, but because she wanted those 3 days to be hers alone. 3 days of sitting with the enormity of it, mapping its dimensions the way she mapped everything, finding the edges of it and the depth of it, and understanding what it meant before she brought anyone else into the room where she was thinking about it. She told him on the 4th day at dinner plainly, "I am expecting a baby," she said. "In May, I believe, based on the timing." Wallace set down his fork. "Are you well?" he asked. His voice was very careful. "I am perfectly well," she said. "I have had no significant symptoms. I spoke with Dr. Calloway in town last week, and he confirms the pregnancy and sees no concerns." "You spoke with the doctor last week," he said. "I wanted information before I had this conversation," she said. "I cannot discuss a thing properly without information." He looked at her across the table, this woman he had married in a valley she had navigated to by starlight, and he felt something so profound and complete that there were no adequate words for it, so he did not try to use words. He got up from his chair and came around the table and crouched beside her chair and took her hand in both of his, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and they stayed like that for a long time. "A May baby," he said finally. "I believe so," she said. "I am going to need to expand the cabin," he said. "I have already drawn up the plans," she said. He laughed, that deep, real laugh, and she leaned forward and pressed her forehead to his. And outside the cabin windows the valley was purple and dark in the early autumn dusk, and the stars were just beginning, and both of them felt it, the particular completeness of a life that has arrived at the place it was always heading. The winter of 1863 to 1864 was the longest and coldest the valley had seen in a decade, and Alma kept teaching through most of it, wrapping herself in additional wool layers and building the school's stove up to a productive warmth that had the children half drowsy by afternoon. The school enrollment had grown by February to 22 students, and she had petitioned the territorial authority for formal school status and a small stipend, which was granted in January. A small, important victory that she announced to Wallace by placing the official document on the table beside his supper plate without comment. He read it. "Miss Alma Pritchard granted status as a certified school instructor," he read, and then looked up. "It still says, Miss, that is a bureaucratic delay," she said. "I have sent the correction." "Mrs. Alma Wells," he said, and the way he said it, quietly and with precision as though he was placing something valuable down carefully, made her close her eyes for a moment. "Yes," she said. The cabin expansion was completed in March. A second room added to the west side with a proper window and a small iron stove, which would serve as a nursery and eventually, Alma had already decided, as a study for when she needed to work in the evenings after the baby was asleep. She was practical about it from the beginning, practical in the way that she was practical about everything, which was to say that she planned meticulously and left room in the plan for the world to contradict her when it needed to. The baby arrived in May, as she had predicted, on a Sunday afternoon when the valley was green and loud with the birds that came every spring, and the process of arrival was long and difficult in the way that first labors often are, with Dr. Calloway attending and Eunice Marks providing additional support, and Wallace in the other room being more frightened than he had been of anything in his life, including river crossings and mountain passes, and one encounter with a rattlesnake in the Nebraska sandhills that he had not told Alma about at the time. The baby was a boy. He was large and healthy and announced his arrival with impressive volume, and when Calloway placed him in Alma's arms, she looked at him with the focused intensity she brought to star charts and river crossings and said, "Hello," in a tone of such complete seriousness that the baby stopped crying, as though he recognized the register. Wallace came in and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son and his wife, and the expression on his face was one that Alma would remember for the rest of her life, open and overwhelmed and entirely without armor, the face of a man who has just understood something about the world that no amount of practical preparation could have explained in advance. "What will we name him?" he asked. "I have been thinking about it," she said. "My father's name was Everett. Your father's name?" "James," he said. "Everett James Wells," she said. "Yes," Wallace said, immediately and completely. Everett James Wells grew into a boy with his mother's dark eyes and his father's laugh, and a particular gift for sitting still and watching things with complete attention, which he could have inherited from either of them. By the time he was walking, he was already following his mother to the school on mornings when she brought him along, sitting in the corner with whatever object interested him, usually a rock or a button or a small piece of smooth wood, while his mother taught, and occasionally looking up at the star charts on the wall with the focused curiosity of someone who is already beginning to understand that the world is full of things worth knowing. A second child arrived in the summer of 1866, another boy, whom they named Thomas after the Dempsey child, whose wrist Wallace had set on the 4th day out of independence. Thomas Wells came into the world easier than his brother had in the early morning, and was quieter and more watchful from the start, a child who thought carefully before he spoke, and who preferred to understand a thing completely before expressing an opinion about it, which people sometimes called shyness and was actually precision. The school grew. By 1866, Alma had 28 students and had trained a teaching assistant, a young woman named Ruth Alderton, whose family had arrived from Kansas the previous year, and who had a natural gift for working with the youngest students, and who took to the celestial navigation lessons with a hunger that reminded Alma powerfully of herself at 12, sitting outside with her father under the Missouri sky. "You should apply to the Territorial School Authority for permanent certification," Alma told Ruth, one Friday after the older students had gone home. "You have more than sufficient competency. You would be one of the first certified female teachers in this territory." Ruth looked at her. "Do you think they will accept my application?" "I think they should," Alma said. "I think the argument for it is clear and well supported. I also think there will be resistance from some quarters because there is always resistance from some quarters, and the correct response to resistance is a better prepared argument, not a lesser ambition." Ruth applied. There was resistance. Alma wrote 3 letters to the Territorial Authority on Ruth's behalf, each one more precisely argued than the last, and Ruth was certified in the spring of 1867. When the certification arrived, Ruth came to Alma's school with the document, and Alma looked at it and felt a feeling she recognized from her own experience, but which was this time larger and less personal, which she supposed was what her father had felt every time a student left his school carrying more than they had arrived with. The farm flourished. Wallace had found his rhythm with it, the rhythm of someone who has made all the classic mistakes once and learned them completely, and the land responded to that kind of careful and honest attention. By 1866, he was selling surplus wheat to the mill in Millhaven, and by 1867 he had saved enough to replace the original cabin entirely with a proper house. 2 stories, 5 rooms, a covered porch that faced the mountains, a kitchen with a proper iron stove, and in the best upstairs room a window that Alma had specified must face north, so she could watch Polaris from her bed if she wanted to, which she sometimes did. Lying in the dark beside Wallace with the window open and the stars clear, and the valley quiet and everything that mattered within the reach of her hand, she still kept her star charts. She updated them each season and taught from them each Friday, and occasionally, on the clearest nights of the year, she brought the older students out into the schoolyard after dark and let them navigate by starlight, compass in hand, finding their position by nothing more than what was above them. And she told them each time what her father had told her. The stars are fixed and you are not, but if you know where the fixed things are, you can always find your way home. Wallace stood at the edge of those sessions, watching, and he had learned enough in the years since that first morning before Fort Laramie that he could find any constellation she named in less than a minute. And he sometimes stood out there long after the students had gone in, and Alma had banked the school stove. Just looking at the sky she had given him access to, feeling the particular comfort of knowing where you are in a very large world. In 1868, a letter arrived from Henry, Alma's cousin who had survived the war and was now living in St. Louis with a wife and a small daughter. He wrote to say he was thinking of coming west. The letter was long and full of questions about the valley and the soil and the quality of life and the availability of land, and Alma wrote back with a thoroughness that filled 12 pages and included a hand-drawn map of the valley with annotations. Henry came in the spring of 1869. He arrived with his wife, Ellen, and their daughter, Margaret, who was 4 and had Henry's coloring and Ellen's curiosity, and they stopped at the Wells house first, which had become a reliable first stop for anyone coming into the valley who needed orientation, because people in Millhaven knew that if you needed to understand where you were and where things were in relation to each other, the schoolteacher's house was the correct destination. Henry looked at Alma across the dinner table that first evening, at the house and the books covering every available shelf, and the star charts framed on the wall, and the 2 dark-eyed boys, Everett nearly 5 and Thomas almost 3, who ate their supper with the serious efficiency of children raised by people who did not treat meals as casual affairs. And he said, "Father always said you would build something worth building." Alma looked at her cousin, this man she had not seen in 7 years, and felt the particular warmth of being recognized by someone who has known you long enough to see what you have done in the context of everything you were before you did it. "He was right about most things," she said. "Was he right about stars?" Henry asked, noticing the charts. "About stars he was exactly right," she said. Wallace, at the head of the table, caught her eye, and the look that passed between them contained everything. The handkerchief pressed into her hand before the wagons rolled, and the early morning before Fort Laramie when she pointed at Polaris and told him that was north, and the fire at the high mountain meadow where she had told him about her father, and he had simply stayed beside her, and the school building on the October morning when he had asked her to marry him, and she had said she had conditions, and the May morning when Everett was put in her arms, and Wallace came through the door with his face entirely open, and the 7 years between all of that and this dinner table with the children and the cousin and the valley outside the windows going gold in the spring light. She smiled at him, fully and completely, the way she had smiled in the school building on the day he proposed, and he smiled back, and that was its own complete conversation. Henry found his land. Ellen found her footing in the valley. Margaret grew up running between the 2 households with the freedom of a child who has adults she trusts on every side, and she was in Alma's school within a year, and proved to have a particular aptitude for mathematics that Alma cultivated with patient enthusiasm. The school, by 1870, had 35 students and 2 teachers, Alma and Ruth, and a formal reading library of 62 books that Alma had assembled over 8 years through a combination of her own collection, donations from arriving settlers, and a determined correspondence with a bookseller in Portland who gave her a favorable rate because he respected her commitment, and also because she was a reliably good judge of which books were worth buying. Everett started school there himself and was a good student, though not the most patient, and Thomas was better with patience than his brother, but needed more encouragement with arithmetic, and both of them were capable navigators by the time they were 8, which Alma considered a non-optional baseline. Wallace taught them both to ride and to read a farm soil and to handle tools with respect, and both boys grew up understanding that the farm and the school were the same kind of thing, a thing you built with honesty and care, and then tended every day because it would only give back what you put into it. There was a third child, a girl, born in the spring of 1871, whom they named Ada after a mathematician that Alma had read about in a scientific pamphlet and admired extravagantly. Ada Wells arrived in the world with opinions clearly already formed, and she expressed them from her first weeks with a volume and persistence that made Everett, then 6, walk around the house for the first month, wearing the expression of a person being subjected to an extended natural phenomenon. Thomas simply studied her from a careful distance, the way he studied everything, and eventually made friends with her on his own terms. Ada grew into the kind of child who asks why with complete sincerity 7 times before breakfast and means it every time, and Alma taught her star navigation at 5, and she memorized the major constellations in 2 weeks, and then asked why the stars were where they were, which led to a conversation about the nature of the galaxy that was one of the best conversations Alma had ever had, and that ended with both of them looking at the night sky for an hour without speaking, just looking. Wallace watched this from the porch with a contentment so deep it had no bottom. "She is going to terrify a great deal of the world," he said to Alma. "Good," Alma said, sitting down beside him. "The world could use it." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, which was still slightly startling to both of them in the way that very good things remain slightly startling even after years of having them, because there is a kind of happiness that never becomes entirely ordinary no matter how long you are in it. Below them the farm lay quiet in the autumn dark, the wheat stubble silver in the moonlight, the creek glinting, the mountain standing at the edge of everything where they had always stood, patient and enormous and indifferent and beautiful. "I want to tell you something," Wallace said. "Tell me," she said. "I think about that first morning," he said. "The morning I found you before dawn with the stars. I had gone out to check Patterson's hoof and I came around the wagon and there you were, just completely at home in the dark, completely certain of where you were, completely uninterested in whether I understood what you were doing or not. I had given you a handkerchief the day before because I assumed you would need it and you were sitting there navigating. And I thought." He stopped. "What did you think?" she asked. "I thought I have entirely misunderstood something important," he said, "about what women are capable of, about what a person needs from a companion, about what the world looks like when you pay proper attention to it." He paused. "I had not understood any of that before that morning. You taught me all of it." She was quiet for a moment. The night was very still. "You taught me something too," she said. "What?" "That being steady for someone is not the same as directing them," she said. "My father was that for me, and I did not know how to let another person be that for me again after he died. I thought being steady meant being in charge. You are steady without being in charge, and it took me a long time to understand that was what I had been missing." He held her more closely. "We were both figuring it out," he said. "We were," she agreed. "We still are." "I hope we are still figuring it out when we are very old," he said. "We will be," she said, with the certainty of someone who has navigated by fixed stars for long enough to trust the fixed things. Everett Wells, when he was 15, asked his mother to teach him everything she knew about celestial navigation. He had been learning it all his life, the way you learn things that are simply part of the air of a household, but now he wanted it formally and completely, and with the full attention of the teacher rather than the mother. Alma taught him the way her father had taught her, beginning with the fixed point and working outward, teaching not just the mechanics but the meaning, the history of every culture that had looked at the same sky and found it legible, the hundreds of generations of sailors and farmers and travelers and storytellers who had learned to read the dark by its lights. She taught him for 3 months, 2 evenings a week, sitting at the table in the school after the other students had gone home, and it was the finest 3 months of teaching she had done since the first year, when the knowledge was newer to her students, and therefore newer to her in the teaching of it. When they finished, Everett could navigate as accurately as any person in the valley except his mother, and he said to her, at the end of the last session, "Grandpa would have liked this." Alma looked at her son, who had her dark eyes and his father's laugh and was growing into a person she liked enormously without quite having predicted the particular shape of him. "He would have loved you," she said, without reserve. Thomas Wells took a different path with the knowledge. He became interested in the mathematics of it, the calculations of position and angle and distance that underlay the navigation, the formal geometry of stars. At 16, he had written a 40-page document about it that was so precise and original that Alma sent it to the territorial school authority with a recommendation, and it ended up being discussed at a school convention in Portland the following year, as an example of the remarkable things a frontier education could produce. Ada Wells, at 13, already knew things about the cosmos that her teachers could not keep up with, and Alma wrote to a professor at a newly established college in Portland explaining the situation and asking for reading materials. And the professor wrote back with a list, and then, impressed by the particularity and intelligence of the letter, wrote again to ask if he might correspond directly with the student herself. And a remarkable correspondence began that Ada maintained for the rest of her childhood and beyond. Wallace watched his children grow with the steady amazement of a man who knows he has had extraordinary luck and is not ungrateful for it. He expanded the farm again in 1873, added a second field of corn, hired 2 young men from nearby farms to help with the harvest, and began to build something that felt less like a farm and more like a legacy, not inherited but constructed, deliberately, and with full understanding of everything that had been lost before and why. He wrote to his brothers every month. The older one, Robert, came to visit in 1874 with his wife and saw the farm and the house and the valley and the school, and said he understood now why Wallace had come west, and Wallace said he had not understood it himself when he started. He had thought he was going toward a farm, and he had ended up at something considerably more than that. Robert asked what, and Wallace looked at Alma across the dinner table, who was deep in a conversation with Robert's wife about the merits of various teaching methods, and was gesturing with a fork to illustrate a point, and he said simply, "Everything I did not know I needed." The years settled and deepened. Millhaven grew from a small settlement to a proper town with a main street and a general store and a doctor's office and a church, and at its center, the school that had started in a single room and now occupied 3 connected buildings and served 60 children and 3 teachers. Alma was its principal, which was a title she had invented for herself when the school grew too large for any other description to be accurate, and the title was recognized by the territorial authority in 1876 in a formal letter that she framed and hung on the school wall beside her father's compass, which she had by then mounted in a small case of its own, cleaned and polished, the needle still pointing faithfully north. On the evening of the day the letter arrived, she and Wallace sat on the porch of the house as they did most evenings in good weather, with the mountains turning color in the last light and the farm quiet below them and the sounds of the children somewhere inside. And she held the territorial letter and the silver compass and looked at the mountains. "I used to look at maps in Missouri," she said, "and try to imagine this. The valley, the mountains, what it would feel like to have built something here." "What did you imagine?" he asked. "Nothing like this," she said. "I imagined the school and the land and the work. I did not imagine you. I did not imagine the boys or Ada. I did not imagine that building something would mean building something with someone." She looked at him. "I thought it would be solitary. I had planned for it to be solitary. I was prepared to be satisfied with solitary." "And," he said, "and this is so much better than solitary," she said, "that I can barely remember what I thought the appeal was." He reached over and took her hand, the same hand he had taken in the fort yard when the war news arrived, and in the new school building when he asked her to marry him and 1,000 times since, and she closed her fingers around his, and the mountains went from gold to red to purple in the sky above the valley. They had navigated to by starlight and determination and one discarded map. "I threw my map away," he said, for the second time, and it meant the same thing it had always meant and more besides. "I know," she said. "I am glad you did." "So am I," he said. "So am I." The stars came out above the valley as they had always come out, fixed and faithful, and Polaris was exactly where it had always been, north, unwavering, the anchor of the sky. And below it, two people sat on a porch in the Willamette Valley in the year 1876 and held on to each other. And the night was very large and very still and entirely full of everything they had built and everyone they loved. And there was nothing missing and nothing unresolved and nothing left to wish for that they did not already have.